Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about illustrations. Illustrations date back all the way to the 38,000 BCE. Caves in all 7 continents have evidence of early forms of illustration. Back then, the folks were using whatever means that they could find to make these illustrations. Some of them are ground up pieces of rock. Some of them are actually pigments that they created. But nonetheless, if we look at all these cave illustrations, we can pretty much get a visual history of what's going on in the times. Going up into the Egyptian era and the hieroglyphics, Egyptians were using images as symbols and no letter form. So this is the translation of the letters to what the symbol meant. So they were using images, simple images, to illustrate what the letter would, or what the story would be. So if you can imagine spelling your name out using these characters, mine would be like the owl, these two parallel lines at a slant angle. There's the little squiggly for an N, and then the H would be this little piece of rope that's tying on itself. They have well over 1,000 distinct characters that we could either tell a story or could be spelled out into a different story or a different word. In the 1100s, in the Common Era, English, the European coat of arms was the early forms of a logo. The symbol was oftentimes found on a shield or a flag. Especially if you're in a battle, you want to be able to identify, your coat of arms from another coat of arms, so you know where your colleagues are. And then there are simple illustrations that became a little bit more elaborate, a little bit more detailed, but ultimately it's an illustration of some sorts using either paint or whatever means that they had possible at the time. In the 1800s, late 1800s and early 1900s, there were hobos, traveling workers, who developed a visual code for each other to provide information or warnings about where they're going. So the hobos often traveled on trains. And this is when the Continental Divide was fully active, so folks from East Coast can travel to the West Coast. And oftentimes they didn't have money. They were educated, or very little education. So as for a community, they developed a language that could, with illustrations that they can mark at a train station or a small town where they got off, and folks would look for these little symbols and to be able to tell them where, like, say, bread is, or they can tell the difference between a gentleman or wealthy, because you have the top hat that's come up with a pyramid, or a woman, because women used to wear these hoop skirts at the time. And then you have various different symbols that they could pass on to the next traveler. It's very short illustrations. More common and more modern versions of illustrations can be found like in the National Park Services. And this is the map signage that was created in the 1970s, and subsequently all these symbols became part of not only national parks, but became part of state parks and city parks and county parks, and got disseminated out to all the park services. So it's consistency between the different agencies. This is one of the most common ones, which is the tent. You have also the restrooms, but you can easily identify in a very short time what each of these services are. The one I like to point out right here is this one here. This is actually not Wi-Fi. It's actually something I found one day. The only time I've ever seen this is in a park up in Deception Pass up in Washington. And this is actually an auditorium. So this is the person who would be speaking, and then this would be the audience. And I've only seen it once, but it's one of these things that you can find. Yeah, I have seen the Wi-Fi one in parks, but not necessarily this one here. But it's it took me a while to figure it out. But the others are fairly reasonable to figure out what you're going to find at these points in the national parks. When we talk about illustrations, we talk about in a traditional form and a digital form. All the ones you just previously saw were all traditional. Even the 1970s National Park Services signs, they were actually hand drawn at the time, using various tools and being very exacting. It could look digital, but it really was actually they were hand drawn, since it was pre-computers. But traditional takes on multiple different mediums: pencils, pen and ink, charcoal, watercolor, acrylic, wood cut, paint, even rocks or certain stones, certain plants can give you materials to do an illustration with. And these are various examples of the traditional mediums. Pen and ink and paint brushes can be very fine in detail. Here's something a little bit more simplified, but it's a wood cut, so you have to dig out and hand carve all the parts you don't want to print, and then the ink, the black part, is the part that's going to print on a piece of paper. So it's a combination of wood cut and ink. This appears to be charcoal, and then this looks like watercolor. But the idea is that whichever medium you're using, you're giving some sort of representation of what that object or item that you're drawing out. And this one I love here because the bee is so detailed, and if you ever stood and watched a bee, you would see that there's all these tiny little hairs on it, even down to their, the ends of their legs. And it's just a really beautiful thing to look at up close. But nonetheless, there's for an illustrator, it's a form of interpretation as well. You can also leave out information, or you can, sometimes a bee might have a missing little antennae, and then you can put it back in, or you can change it in a different direction. So what you're doing is recreating and reinterpreting what's existing in the real world and bring it into a context using whatever medium you choose. When we talk about digital illustrations, they come in two forms. There's the vector, and then there's a freehand digital illustration. The vector is more precise and it's mathematically based. Freehand is mimicking what traditional illustration forms are. Freehand often uses a stylus or a digital pen and a tablet to kind of create that image. From the tablet, you can choose different paint brushes or sponges or different items that you can use to draw with, or you could choose different inks or watercolor. It kind of gives you that feeling of trying to do something that's traditional, but it's very digital because you don't have that tactile experience. And vector, which is what we're going to specifically look at more in this class, relies a lot on minimalism, emphasis, and interpretation. Vector oftentimes is what we call a mathematical way of drawing things, and it's not necessarily we're using math per se, but it's on a graph. It's on a it's plotting points and interpreting the line, which we'll get more into when we open up Illustrator. Illustrations, especially for a vector-based, we want to minimize the image to shape and form. Vector-based oftentimes reduces the details to just the bare essential items, so you can recognize what it is. And it's really quite the opposite of traditional means, where you're trying to get real detailed and and really precise. So in this example, here is a digital illustration or a vector-based illustration of a bee. We could add color to it, and then it'll really solidify to the reader that there's a bee. But ultimately, comparing the traditional to the vector-based, you can see that a lot of the information has been taken away. There's not these little fuzzies that come off the legs. There's not the tip here, which is I think how they use to hold on to things, or when they're landing or something. You can also start imagining how much further you can reduce, because maybe in another variations you don't need these intricate lines here on the wings, maybe not. Sometimes, with vector-based illustrations, the lines are a little bit more like harder edged and squared. You can spend a lot of time going from this version and making a little bit more rounded and unique shapes. But ultimately, you're still just reducing it down to the bare essentials of, so you can recognize what it is. Speaking of bees, Ryan Neff graduated from the Edmonds College in 2013 with a visual communications degree. He created this bee logo. It's a logo for the biology department on campus. The biology department was actually harvesting honey. We actually had for a time being, I think we still have it, a bee farm. And they were harvesting honey, and they asked for a logo because they were going to package the honey and put a label on it and sell it to the Edmonds community. So the idea is that he was talking with the biology department and creating an illustration, and he brought it down to the bare essentials. He even put a little dabs of honey of how they collect it, and created this logo. And ultimately, the logo went, here's the jars of honey that they were making. They were all also making hand salve out of the honey. And these were only sale for like $5 a jar, and you get a thing of honey every year. So in addition to the logo, to the logo or the image mark, he also created typography to complement the logo. So he has a typographical logo, and then he has an image logo. And this is still being used to this day. But it just shows that there's different ways to interpret an object or an item, and you're in charge of figuring what to include and what not to include. Another part of illustrations. This has been done in traditional form and can be done very easily in a digital form. It's called the figure ground reversal illustration. It's basically merging two or more images into a single image, where it becomes very dynamic and intertwined. And then you have to kind of decide which is of the two, which is the one that you see dominantly and which is the one you see second. I'll give you a couple of examples here. Here's the logo for the USA Network. There is actually no physical S in this. And when we look back in our principles of design, the black part here is what we call the figure, the object or the shape that we recognize. And then the space around the recognizable shape is the negative space. So for instance, the word network, that would be the positive, you recognize it. And then the background or the figure or the ground would be the negative white space in the back.